explore in this fairly short presentation some ideas, strategies for facilitating discussions when things get difficult, the kinds of problems and challenges we might need to be on the lookout for, to expect. So that's the goal that we have here. Um, for the overview, what I would really hope that we can get out of today is thinking together about what goes into instructional decision making, the range of what might be possible based on the situation, the context, the needs, when teachers find themselves in the position of guiding discussions on difficult topics. And again, we think of this very broadly: contentious, controversial, hard, painful, traumatic. Uh, so we can mean all of these things when we talk about difficult topics. And so you can see on the plan here that we've put together some slides on various strategies for the different kinds of situations that you might encounter in the name of teaching difficult topics. So next slide. So strategies that you can use before even or during a discussion that could get heated. So this is sort of two ways of thinking about it. One is preemptive. You've got a sense based on your knowledge of your students or your community that there's a possibility this discussion could get heated. And then there's the, oh, I see the steam. It's getting heated now. So I'll start with a strategy that is foundational to how I run my teacher training program in social studies education for initial teachers. But I hold this up as for any teacher who's involved in social education that could run into these controversies, contentions, difficult issues. It's an ongoing educational skill and orientation. Alternate framing of issues. So I would make a case that a willingness to plan and teach around alternate framing is a really good, well, I would say it's a really good educational goal just for its intellectual value. But where it really can shine is as a preemptive preparation for difficult topics. So alternate framing is, in some ways, it's just another way of saying multiple perspectives, or multiple causation. I've more recently heard a fancy phrase like multi-perspectivity. All of these would be part of alternate framing, but the reason I do like that label of alternate framing is because it acknowledges up front that how we describe the thing we're teaching, how we describe the thing to be discussed, the labels, the quote unquote sides, those are choices. How many sides are there? Are we positioning the difficult topic as, well, it's either this perspective or that perspective? It's either this one group or that other group, or is it more than that? Those are all decisions. And if teachers are concerned about the potential difficulty of a topic, of a discussion, being prepared in advance to frame that in alternate ways can provide some early shape, by saying, okay, we're going to look at this, and I want us to just from the very beginning to understand that there is more than one way to look at it. We're going to talk about this issue, but we're going to use different labels based on which perspective is talking about it. And so it gets the learning process to become more comfortable with a little bit of ambiguity, some variance in labeling, the understanding that some people are going to talk about the issue in one way, and others will talk about it in another way. Uh, I would suggest for alternate framing, whenever possible and age appropriate, it's ideal to do it with more than just two frames. For almost any issue of any degree of complexity, there is more than one way, more than two ways, excuse me, more than two sides usually. If you have just the two frames, it can often boil down to maybe a bifurcation that's a little hard. It's kind of, you have to take this side or take that side. Whereas if you can have three or four frames, people then can see a little bit more nuance, and they don't have to feel that it's necessarily an adversarial way of looking at it. That was the failing of the old, back when I was young, and some of you may remember it as well, when it used to be kind of the political issues, the social issues debates, and it was like, well, what's the Republican perspective and what's the Democrat perspective? The problem there is it positions it only as this bifurcation. Getting beyond that is, I think, very, very helpful, and will encourage students not to feel that they're going to have to choose one box or another. But the whole goal here is really important to stress with alternate framing. The goal in expressing the frames is not to persuade. By looking at something through multiple perspectives, multiple options, it's not saying that one is right and others are wrong. This is not about persuasion. It's about helping students better understand those different perspectives. And ultimately, even if their views don't change, they'll understand why people might disagree. Now, another thing that can be done preemptively, or you can be prepared to do it during execution, is distancing. This is an approach that will position an issue that is very heated or very sensitive in its current context in a distant, more remote context. Often it's older. And this will provide some intellectual distance from students' own contemporary personal experience or views. So if this is something that they're looking at not as, well, it's not directly related to my own perspective or values today, but I can see it played out at another context, that emotional distance might make it more approachable. So there are all sorts of tense issues that have historical antecedents, which could be primarily investigated. So you're primarily investigating this other context, but it is an antecedent to something that is tense today. And this will allow for the deeper understanding of the general issue with a contemporary application, rather than focusing on the current context specifically. So again, I'd point out that what we would call temporal distance or time distance, it's not your only option. It might be the one that comes to mind most readily. We'll just go further back in time and look at something in its more elemental form. But you can use what you might call space distancing too. So a tense issue in this country, in our society, often has a counterpoint in another country that can be investigated for a more general understanding. And again, you use space for distancing, and then you can draw connections back to an application to the more sensitive or heated context in our own society. Well, what happens when, for all your best efforts, you've got this discussion going and then it starts to get heated? Oftentimes, one of the best things that you can do is to stop any heated exchanges before they accelerate, get worse, or become more antagonistic. But you don't want to stop the learning. And this is where writing can come in. And I'm sure all of you have encountered quick writes in the past. Quick writes can be a really useful tool when you need to interrupt a heated discussion. So and this doesn't have to sound punitive. It doesn't have to sound like you don't trust your students to talk, or you're trying to end their talking. You can use this as a way to say, I think we need you students to take some time to collect your thoughts in writing. So once you have text down, then maybe you can return to it and proceed from that, because students may feel more in control, and able to select more thoughtfully what they want to share, or how to say it, if they spend a few minutes writing it down. Um, I would also suggest that a little time break can just cool down tempers. It can cool down the environment. Um, so that is something that, in fact, you could even plan to do a quick write preemptively if you want, but it's always something you can turn to in the moment. So let's move on to an example. How about so alternate framing? This is something I wanted to share, a very current example of how we could, what I mean by multiple perspectives, multiple options that are more than just a two-way split, a polarization of it's this or that. So let's take the whole debate about masking and vaccine requirements, or mandates, and again, how we label them is very, very important, and acknowledging that different perspectives would label them in different ways is part of alternate framing. um, so how can examining the different frames about masks and vaccine and the underlying tensions help us understand what makes this topic difficult? Well, let's kind of break this across maybe four widely inclusive frames. And here I've chosen to label them with broader descriptions that really try to get to the outlook of where different groups would be looking at this. So one perspective on this would be what I've called here necessary and appropriate. In other words, this would be people who look at the COVID pandemic and would say, this is really serious. I'm really worried about this. There are really large numbers of deaths. Um, and thus, almost anything we would do is necessary and appropriate to try to halt the spread, or limit the severity of cases. So this perspective would emphasize why it's necessary, and would also then try to justify anything done in terms of appropriateness. In other words, it's necessary, but we can do this in a way that really doesn't violate any of the norms of a society that has laws about keeping itself safe. Well, another frame we could call the personal freedom frame, which is, well, the whole reason we have rights, the whole reason we have a constitution with personal liberties, is to protect us from a society saying, you have to do this, you must do that. Most people want to do this, thus you have to do that. And if your personal freedoms don't hold in a crisis, then how are they rights? How are they actually liberties if they can be taken away when just enough people are scared? And so this frame would emphasize the precedent, kind of a slippery slope, or the rights of individuals to dissent, and not have mass society force them to do something that might be they just don't want to do, or against their conscience. Another way of framing it would be a risk threshold, that ultimately this is about different people feeling comfortable with different levels of risk. And so the reason this is so contentious is some people, they will look at the odds of COVID death and will find those frightening and too high. Others will look at them and will say, I'm not afraid of those odds. Maybe I'm in an age cohort where the odds are just they're so low that they're no worse than other things like dying from automobile accidents or home accidents. So again, different people might look at that differently based on their own risk profile. But this approach would then stress, well, what we're really looking at is a disagreement over risk thresholds. So what does this mean then in terms of how public policy is either not having people do something or forcing people to do something based on how risk is being processed? Do we really actually understand what the real medically accurate risks are? And then how about a fourth one, just loss of trust? So the reason I suggested this for a framing label is that it would be really easy to characterize a particular perspective. We've seen this in a lot of media where perspectives are characterized, and again, this is why the labels are so important. If you start slapping on labels that one faction wants to apply to another faction, in a sense, you're automatically dismissing one perspective as inferior, sometimes just as inferior people. So what we can do here then is we can get away from kind of name calling and instead get to the source of whether you call it, say, vaccine hesitancy or mask resistance or anti-vax or anti-mandate. Oftentimes these things get being very casually lumped together. What we can get at is ultimately the underlying perspective is a loss of trust. No longer having trust in the agencies, the bureaucracies, the medical institutions, the hospitals, the whole financial system of medicine and pharmaceuticals. I mean, there's all of these areas where people have lost trust. And so they don't want to believe what they are being told by groups they don't trust. So what we would do here is once you've explored through, again, more than two perspectives, you can start to look at how each frame would critique the others. So how would the necessary and appropriate frame, someone who's advocating that, critique the risk threshold frame or the loss of trust frame? And then how would the risk threshold frame, for example, respond to that critique? And again, it's not about trying to persuade. It's not about, this is what you should do or not do. This is about, can we understand what these different perspectives represent and how they would debate the issue? And ultimately, we would hope in this kind of situation that it would lead to trying to understand how this issue can help us identify larger democratic principles. We'd want to make it clear that the reason there is disagreement is because there are different visions of the democratic principles at stake. So in free societies, there is always tension between freedom and rights and security or safety. This is a perennial, and we can see that as an underlying theme. How I might respond to unplanned topics that students bring up that may be difficult. So there's an important consideration that I would always suggest you have to keep in mind. That is that your students, you need to consider their feelings, their needs, but also your responsibilities. This is kind of a balancing act. So what are the trade-offs between taking the opportunity, sort of thinking of it as a teachable moment when they bring up something difficult and you're like, oh yeah, I really should take advantage of that. This is a teachable moment, versus setting it aside. Uh, and I would stress first and foremost is you think about that. You've got responsibilities, you've got a time schedule, you've got coverage that you've planned. You're putting that at risk when you go for that opportunity for a difficult teachable moment. And it may not be appropriate for your overall class needs. And as hard as it is, you need to give yourself permission to say no, to set it aside. And we can do this in a really respectful way that doesn't close the door to returning to it. So you could say something like, oh, you've brought up a really important topic, but we don't have time today to give it the attention it deserves. Could we please set it aside for another time when we do? Um, that is fair, reasonable, respectful, and appropriate, because it basically says, well, the lessons that you planned and the curriculum you're teaching, that's important too. Then, related to this is consider whether this is really the appropriate time to embrace a topic that's been raised, that it could be difficult or heated. I mean, even if it's germane, um, you kind of want to ask yourself, if I make this shift now, if I change what I'm focusing on now, how does it affect the clarity, the coherence of the content that I'm teaching in this lesson, and also your pedagogical goals? Um, so many of you may have experienced or use yourself the technique of the parking lot, the idea that you keep on your whiteboard, or maybe it's a computer file these days. I'm old enough to I've briefly used a chalkboard, and it's sort of this persistent list of things that came up in class that you do want to return to, just not at that moment. And so again, this is being prepared to tell students, oh yeah, I agree with you. This is worth discussing, but it's going to take thought. I'm not prepared to do it right now. So let's put this in the parking lot, and I will make sure then that I am prepared to talk about that, say, before the end of the unit. Um, and then another element here would be consider whether it's personal interest or if it's relevant to the whole group. So to the extent that the issue being raised, the topic being raised is personal, would it be better than to do that as a personal conversation? And so you could say something like, hey, I'm glad you've got that interest. Maybe you and I can talk about it during a break or during lunch. So then let's move on to 3 here. Well, how might you preempt or choose to address the things that are really hard when topics are difficult, tense, contentious, insensitive, or harmful comments? Well, I think the first thing I would suggest kind of just takes us all back to initial teacher certification training, where we are all told, well, establish your classroom norms. um, and ultimately, that is really your first line of defense. Um, I just might suggest, if you plan to wade into difficult waters, and at times in your class you will be confronting contentious issues, difficult, sensitive, traumatic topics, you want to establish your norms to accommodate that. So, in certain kinds of classes where you just don't foresee topics ever becoming tense, you might not take on things like, specifically, what are the valid boundaries of what we talk about, or what kinds of things would we consider, slurs. Uh, so your norms that you would be establishing throughout your class environment would include the boundaries, and also why. So, Holocaust denialism. Right? So I know you may find websites, or you may have relatives who deny that the Holocaust happened, but this is an academic classroom, and the overwhelming historical evidence is that it happened at a very massive scale and, killed at least 6 million Jews. So, we're not going to entertain theories that it didn't happen, because that's not academic. So the boundaries is Holocaust denialism. That's not something we're going to talk about in class. Same with slurs. You may get upset at somebody, but anytime you are denigrating that person for who they are, for their identity, their family, their background, their way of being, that's a slur, and we're not going to ever allow that. So you can establish those norms more specifically when you fear that those kinds of comments might happen. And then another thing to, I think, be prepared to do is to thoughtfully phrase your questions or your prompts that will avoid what I kind of call anything goes sharing. There's a common instinct, I guess, among a lot of teachers that, well, you can always ask students, what do you think? How do you feel? Or, well, what would you do? The problem with those kinds of phrasing, especially when the issue is sensitive, traumatic, tense, contentious, is there is no wrong or out of bounds way to respond to that. So, well, how do you feel? Well, I hate everything and everyone. That's not wrong based on the way you phrased it. The way you phrased it would open yourself up to could share anything. So if you phrase your prompts more carefully so that you're providing some boundary and guidance to what they would share, you can one, give more intellectual focus, but you can avoid that anything goes sharing. And then how about when the comment a student is giving seems like it's intended to provoke or rattle others? Be prepared to redirect it. I think what's really important here, though, is not to slam the asker, because all you'll do then is the student who asked it is going to say, well, I guess that's what I get for raising my hand. That's what I get for trying to participate. But you can redirect. So they're saying something that's provocative. You think it's rattling others, and maybe intended to. And you can then say, well, that's a heated way to put it, or whatever adjective you want to insert there. So, hey, let's explore, and then you redirect it to an underlying concept with value for the lesson. So you take what the students kind of threw out there and redirect it in a related way to something that's actually educationally valuable. And then I think we just need to put on the table, be prepared to shut down a conversation that may be causing pain. I would suggest that we as educators can take our own Hippocratic oath. First, do no harm. If something looks like it's harming students psychologically, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, almost any way, I don't care how great your lesson is or how great the topic is. Chances are it's not going to stay in their mind as long as a really painful, hurtful school experience will. Be prepared to close it down if it looks like it's doing harm. You can always come back to it another time in another way when feelings are less raw. So, I've given you a few kind of ways of thinking about phrasing that, telling students, hey, we need to stop for now, because I can tell feelings are raw and this discussion may cause harm. Or I have to stop you there. We don't use slurs in this classroom. So those are times where it's appropriate to sort of shut down what's being said. But you can also move on to another topic. All right, so we're discussing something, but I as the teacher, but the onus on you. I need to do a bit more thinking before I'm prepared to facilitate this conversation. So students, I'm not blaming you. It's fine that you want to talk about this, but I'm not prepared to facilitate it. So I need more time, and that's why we're moving on. And um, you then, of course, you can also check in with individuals privately, right? So if you're not sure, you can ask the students, hey, I noticed that you seem really affected by this. Hey, can I help you? Do you need to step out? Do you want to step out quietly? Keep an eye on your individual students. Um, well, what about the question? So we were talking about comments or topics, but what happens when they ask questions that are difficult? And again, I would take us back to kind of our teacher, our initial teacher training. If you don't know, don't don't give a wrong answer. Don't say something that might be false or might be bad. Just admit it. There's no shame in admitting that you don't know. When you're starting out, you feel that shame, right? I think every 22-year-old, 23-year-old feels shame when you as the teacher say, "Ooh, I don't know the answer to that." But there isn't shame in saying, I don't know that, but I want to find out. Can I get back to you? I don't understand that well. Can we talk about it after I've done some more research? So the shame is in shooting from the hip when you really don't know, because you're likely to give thoughtless or wrong or insensitive answers. Um, what about when students ask big questions like, why do people hate? I think the advice I would give here is avoid what I like to call cosmic philosophizing, where we all kind of put on our own private Freud hat. Well, I think that humans are, when it comes to something like hate, there are so many reasons why people hate. And it's always best to bring it into a particular context that can be meaningfully examined. Because, by making comparisons between contexts, then you can form possible generalizations about the broader human experience. Historical context is always your best ally when you're asked these kinds of big, broad cosmic philosophy questions. So there are clear evidentiary answers for why the Nazis hated Jews. I mean, there's a long history of anti-Semitism in Germany that led to scapegoating for Germany's situation after World War I, combined with the racist theories of racial hygiene that emerged in the 20th century. Um, so, rather than weighing in on, pet theories, go into an actual context. So say, that's a really big question. Let's bring it into something specific so that we can really meaningfully examine it before we make some generalizations. um, Another thing I'd say here is prepare for how you'll handle questions about your beliefs and values. Hey, teacher, what do you think? How do you feel? What do you believe? There are all sorts of different ways that you can respond to it. Um, I've not seen anything persuasive in the research literature that says, oh, this is definitely the right way. Um, but some things that you're going to want to decide for yourself based on the context. How do you want to respond to that? I would just say what matters is that you're prepared to do it, not you're suddenly finding yourself on the fly kind of randomly doing it. But you prepare yourself. Do you want to answer honestly? Hey, this is what I believe, but stress that you don't automatically fault students for questioning. I believe this, but yeah, if you ask a question, if you challenge it, I don't fault you for that. You could, on the other hand, answer non-personally. Oh, this isn't about me. I'm teaching you the consensus concluded by most experts in this field. So my views really don't matter. Um, you could just try to avoid answering directly. I don't think it's appropriate for me to bring up my personal beliefs in class, but hey, maybe we could talk about it privately later. Or you could respond with a kind of redirection. I'm more interested in what you think. All of these are valid ways for teachers to respond. And I would encourage you to sort of prepare yourself based on different contexts. What would you choose? Um, And then the other thing you might want to be prepared for when students are asking difficult questions is to plan for students who just have more background knowledge that may be helpful. So what if you've got that one student who really knows this thing well, really cares about this topic? And so you're going to want to be prepared to kind of not let them dominate. So maybe a preliminary conversation one-on-one. Hey, I know you know so much about this. And I know you're going to ask some really difficult questions, but hey, maybe we could decide those together in advance. We could choose how many you're going to ask for. Um, hey, what you're asking is really complicated. Could we boil it down to something that more students could be involved in? So what about a lack of readiness or the maturity issue when it comes to difficult topics? Uh, so if you're concerned about maturity, begin with a foundational activity. Don't jump into the difficult discussion right from the get-go. Start in a more foundational way and build to the difficult discussion. That way you're kind of getting a sense of where they are in terms of maturity, and you have the opportunity to build readiness to do the more demanding mature thing. Um, when it comes to really complex concepts related to difficult topics, you can try to break them down to a more basic root, right? So if the political complications of a particular genocide are too complex, how come the United States isn't stopping what's happening to the Uyghurs in Western China, if we even want to recognize Xinjiang as Western China? You could ask, so what can one group of people hope to accomplish by hurting a smaller group of people, right? So if your students are not mature enough to handle the big complications of a difficult context, you could take it to the root that they can understand. So what are reasons groups of people might hurt other groups of people? Why might smaller groups of people be more vulnerable to bigger groups of people? That's something that you can use to process, even among very young children. Um, you provide concrete manifestations of abstract topics. So be prepared with young students who are going to say, what's this? Or that sounds silly. Well, give them a concrete manifestation that they can understand. You know, uh, this is the bigger issue, but boy, here's something you can see. Here's something we can look at. But of course, avoid the graphic or the sensational or the provocative. I would say things like, video or sound or photos can be quite concrete. They can, hey, if we want you to think about the consequences of a particular kind of social issue, here's a picture. But if your motivation is for showing it is, it's graphic, or that's sensational, or that'll really provoke a reaction, really ask yourself if that's educationally appropriate for your age level or any age level. And then I would say when it comes to younger learners, we as the educators have to model empathy and sensitivity. We have to show them how it's done. We could verbally reinforce healthy practices when students use them. So get good at saying things to students like, I can tell you feel really strongly here. So I want to thank you for being sensitive and how you express yourself to others. I'm so proud of you for phrasing it in a really caring and gentle way. Give them that kind of praise that models sensitivity and empathy. So yeah, that takes us to the end. I think I ran a little longer than I wanted to, but thanks very much for listening. And I hope these ideas give you some useful food for thought to take with you.